Hello and welcome to From the Ground Up, a podcast from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. My name is Quinn and I'm here with my friends Logan.
Hello there.
And Christian.
Uh,
We're missing Rand today, but we know he's with us in spirit. Today, we are also joined by Nick Epstein, an alumni from the Harris School of Public Policy who's gone on to work in renewable energy and is now serving as the Senior Manager of Renewable Development at Invenergy. Nick, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here virtually.
So, Invenergy occupies an emerging space in an emerging market for renewable energy. Can you help us understand what Invenergy does and specifically what you work on?
Happy to discuss. So, Invenergy is a privately held company and is an IPP or an independent power producer. The firm designs, builds, owns, and operates energy projects, primarily focused on renewable energy projects. I think kind of the bulk of our project portfolio is in utility scale wind, but increasingly there's been a focus on solar projects, battery storage, often, or not often, sometimes we'll co-locate projects with both storage, battery storage and solar within the same project footprint. The company does also own and operate and builds natural gas projects and some pipeline projects on occasion. Invenergy is about a 25-year-old company and is one of the largest players in the industry.
Yeah, so a lot of our listeners are policy students, and they might not know a ton about the energy and environment space. For them, can you give some context on why this work is important in the context of the move from fossil fuels to renewable energy?
Sure. Well, historically, most of the countries in the world's energy infrastructure has been built on the back of fossil fuel extraction and production, coal, oil and gas, natural gas, all of which people know produce a significant amount of carbon emissions. So really this renewable energy industry has developed in the last 20 years as the technology has advanced, as well as there have been pieces of legislation that have helped drive this industry and help kind of subsidize the cost of renewable energy production. The investment tax credit and production tax credit, I think, were actually passed in the early 90s. Funny enough, I think the Chuck Grassley is the longtime Republican senator from Iowa. I think was a big push under the first Bush administration for the ITC and the PTC is something I learned. But this has been an iterative process of the last 20 plus years of a handful of companies, of which Invenergy's been kind of at the vanguard of figuring out how to do this, how to build these projects at scale, wind and solar, working with vendors of photovoltaic panels, working with vendors of giant wind turbines, figuring out how to design and site these projects, how to interact with the utilities to connect them to the grid. And the story has been not only getting better at doing that, really, as these projects have continued to get built out and progress, the quality, the efficiency of the technology has improved and the cost curve continually gets pushed down. Whereas before, in order to be competitive, renewable energy needed subsidies. Now, in large part, certainly compared to coal, wind and solar production are in most cases cheaper now. So it's been a mix of both creating low carbon energy generation and also from a kind of larger geopolitical and policy standpoint, the more independent US-based energy that we can produce, the less reliant we are on foreign producers of oil and gas who are often nations that are not, I guess, in alignment with a lot of the democratic ideals of the United States and our geopolitical competitors. So there was a lot there, but again, I'm happy to follow up with any other thoughts on this line of questioning.
Yeah, I want to pull a little bit on the word utility scale. And especially I'm thinking from the perspective of a consumer. So like I pay my utility company, I pay my utility bill every month. From a consumer's perspective, do you become the utility company instead?
Sure. I think I can try to unpack what you're asking. So there is what we call the retail energy market and kind of the wholesale energy market. So all of us, we likely get our power bill, utility bill from ComEd, your property owner, the same. That is the retail market that serves the majority of individuals and households and businesses. The wholesale market, where an independent power producer like Invenergy participates, is where we're either contracting with the utility itself, where we are building in the United States. We'll negotiate with the utility because they're trying to procure more renewable energy, and we'll sign what's called PPA, or a power purchase agreement, which is basically think of it as like a long-term lease where the utility will say, we will buy energy for the next 25 years at this particular price with an escalator from your power plant that you're looking to build. And then that power purchase agreement is basically a future revenue stream that allows the company to go and finance the project. Likewise, there are what are called C&I customers, which are data center type companies, large manufacturing facilities, where they too can tap into this wholesale market and contract with us or our competitors and say, we're building a large data center or a large manufacturing facility, and we want that to be powered through zero carbon energy. And then they will sign a PPA with us, and then we'll plug into the local grid. And then there's sort of a philosophical question about where all of the molecules go within that grid, but it's basically getting fed into the local system. But it is not the case that you or I could say, we want to get our energy directly from a utility scale renewable energy project. I mean, we could put a solar panel on our roof. Maybe there are smaller wind turbines that folks can put on in their backyards. But by and large, we provide for large customers in that wholesale market.
So during our first few episodes on this podcast, we walked through the story of how a mine gets built, from discovery to site selection to design and operation. And from what you said a minute ago, it sounds like there's kind of a parallel process for developing renewable energy assets. Is that right?
Yes. Go ahead.
As a follow-up question, where do you and your team come in that process?
Sure. That's the fun part. So renewable energy projects, I mean, at the end of the day, they're real estate projects like anything else. So depending on what it is that you're looking to build, there's a number of site selection criteria that you have to take into account. If it's a solar project, you have to look at the availability of consistent solar exposure for a given area. And we have engineers and folks who do very high-end calculations. Typically, you need a large amount of hopefully pretty flat land. You want something that has a pretty proximate location to certain transmission lines. You take into account regulatory issues. Some states and localities make it very, very prohibitive to build or outright ban it in some cases. So there's a lot of factors. We look at topography, kind of the underlying quality of the bedrock is an issue, wetlands. And then if we're looking at a wind project, utility scale solar project can be built on maybe a few thousand acres of land. And you have what are called these power blocks of all these solar panels that are daisy chained together. But wind project can be built over tens of thousands of acres with these windmills being spaced apart. And there, I mean, again, availability of wind, and we have wind engineers who go and do all of this testing. You have to be mindful of airplane pathways, Department of Defense radars, depending on where you are. Permitting and regulatory issues is always something to consider. So there's kind of a very, very detailed set of months-long investigations, sometimes years, to evaluate potential sites that could host these projects. And then obviously you have to go out and talk to the people who own the land. So for a solar project, you could be talking to maybe a dozen, 2 dozen land owners who own different parcels, and we have to go out and negotiate either leases or purchase options with them. With a wind project, considering the larger footprint, that could be hundreds of individuals, and can imagine trying to negotiate with all these people is not an easy feat. So where my team come in, I am on the development team, and we're known sort of as the tip of the spear within the company. So we're the ones, like, we go out and we find the land, we find the project sites, do a lot of that landowner outreach. We work a lot with what are called these land agents, which is something that's sort of bespoke to the renewable energy industry. There's sort of a cottage industry of independent contractors, and these folks go out and like talk to the landowners and help sign contracts, which is not something that you see in the commercial real estate industry. But we're very much on the ground as well, not only when we identify kind of a general area for a project, going out and talking with the landowners, trying to get those parcels under contract, and then we lead the project in every facet kind of through to the construction phase. So me and my team are working very, very closely with renewable engineering, environmental compliance, reconstruction. I mean, there's a huge number of teams that we're dealing with, and we are the lead project managers. So we drive the process. We oversee all of the workflows that are required to get these projects completed, which can take upwards of 10 years. And it's often the case that most developers they get things happen. They don't stay on a project over that period of time. Again, the way that we like to think about it is that all of the other teams within the company sort of work in support of development. So we like to think that we're kind of, I don't want to say the most important team, but maybe the most important team, because nothing happens without development. And it's also the case that a project will not get built, as I mentioned, unless there is a contract to sell that power to an end user, whether that's a utility or a C&I client. There are kind of a few other variables as well. Typically, what we like to do is we like to design, build, own, and operate for the long term the projects that we put together. But it is also the case that we'll do either what are called development transfers, which are we'll package the land together, go through all the permitting processes, get through all of the approvals, but not actually take the project to construction. And then we'll transfer that asset to a third party. Kind of a step further, we'll also do what's called a build transfer, where we'll then go and oversee the construction of the project in question and then transfer ownership of that project to another. And then Invenergy will often like to provide kind of the long-term third-party management and operation of that project, even if we no longer retain legal ownership of it. And what goes into these projects that I know I've learned, again, we have vegetation management teams, folks who think about soil erosion. A lot of communities will require vegetative screening, so you're not seeing the solar panels from the road. Again, we work very, very closely with a lot of environmental compliance. Is something we take very seriously, so we're not disrupting wetlands, and we're in compliance with state and federal laws pertaining to endangered species and protected ecosystems. It's a very extensive process in these projects. There's a lot that goes into making sure that they are done as thoughtfully as possible, respecting both the land as well as the local communities that host them.
Thanks, Nick. So I imagine that financing comes into play here in renewable development. How does financing for these projects play into how Invenergy secures funding? And what role do various financial instruments and stakeholders play into this process?
Well, sure. Well, I mentioned a couple things on a fundamental level. We work very closely with a team called Origination, and they're basically very, very smart sales folks who are pitching or marketing our projects to end users, responding to RFPs from utility or sometimes those industrial clients. And sort of the bread and butter is getting these power purchase agreements, these long-term contracts that guarantee the acquisition of our energy at a certain price, which then allows us to go to the capital markets to get a construction loan to build these projects. There's also, federal tax credits, the investment tax credit, the production tax credit. What's been interesting is that prior to last year, these were federal tax credits that would often lapse. They get extended for a year or 2 years. And so the industry constantly had to deal with the uncertainty of when these tax credits would be available. But with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, they were locked in for 10 years, and which is providing certainty to the industry. They were also enhanced in the value that they provide. And interestingly, with the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, it doesn't actually directly subsidize. It doesn't come to a company like ours, some sort of cash payout to allow us to subsidize the building of the projects, but it subsidizes the purchase of the energy. It makes it cheaper to procure our energy from our projects. So it basically subsidizes the clients or the end users, which in turn redounds to our benefit and makes our projects more attractive in terms of procurement and then more likely to get financed. The financing, the way these projects get financed, every project is sort of done a bit differently, and it's not necessarily my area of expertise, but we could theoretically, the company could finance a project through its own balance sheet, basically through its own checking account, which is not typically what the company does, and not many companies could have the resources to do that. But it's generally a mix of equity investors who are filling up that portion of the capital stack and saying, we will provide you with capital to take limited partner ownership of the project in question, and then banks will provide debt for the construction, and then there's usually what's called a takeout loan for the long-term kind of operation of the project. Is kind of at a high level how these work. But again, there are lots of instruments. There's lots of very, very complicated deal structures and capital structures for these projects. I couldn't necessarily speak to them all, and it is a bit outside the realm of my area of expertise. But generally, there's equity and there's debt, and they get matched together to provide the financing for these projects.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm really glad that you brought up the Inflation Reduction Act, because there are a lot of parallels that are drawn between the IRA and President FDR's New Deal, where there's public-private partnerships with these different programs that exist. But something that's very different with the IRA compared to the New Deal is that the IRA mechanism is very reliant on private infrastructure, right? Private ownership of these different programs, whereas the New Deal private collaboration was still publicly owned, right? So I did want to ask, in that realm with public-private partnerships, could you speak to how do you structure such collaborations to maximize benefits for both the developer, the community, and in the context of renewable energy projects?
Right. Well, public-private partnerships is sort of a term that gets thrown around a lot. And I feel like I actually have some standing in which to speak to this project. Earlier in my career, I was actually part of a group that was doing public-private partnership infrastructure projects for the city of Chicago when Rahm Emanuel was still mayor. And so P3s, as we call them, there's kind of a lot of gray area there, but that is really kind of a general sort of deal and project structure whereby there is a lot of collaboration with the public sector, whether that's a city or a state, and one or more private entities to build something, whether that's the public sector providing some measure of the financing, and then a private entity is going to build it and then operate it, or there's public infrastructure in question that's kind of being put into the deal. There's a lot of very sort of specific models within P3s. And I guess you could say to some extent, anytime there is involvement of both the public and private sector, you could call that a P3. But I think that's not really what most people think about when they're talking about like a real public-private partnership project where a private entity is going to build a bridge or manage a highway that is publicly accessible. One example is a project that I worked on where, at the request of the city of Chicago and the Chicago Transit Authority, I went out and negotiated with, at the time, the 4 largest wireless carriers, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, and Verizon. And working with them, we developed a deal structure where they provided collectively private capital to build what was called a distributed antenna system to provide 4G wireless access in Chicago's 10 miles of subways. Most people don't know that Chicago actually has a fairly robust subway system, so that people could get, at the time, the most advanced wireless service while underground. It was a pretty cool project at no cost to the city of Chicago or taxpayers. So that's sort of P3. The Inflation Reduction Act is basically a form of industrial policy that's providing all sorts of carrots in terms of different financial incentives to basically go out and do things, whether it's building electric vehicles or EV charging infrastructure, and certainly renewable power generation, to make that more attractive for private companies to go and do those things, because the administration and the members of Congress who passed the bill think that there is a larger societal benefit to doing low carbon economy transition type activities so that we can help avoid the worst of climate change. So I think on its scale, you could say it's similar to the New Deal in some ways, but that was a very different program with very kind of different structures that to your point, were not directly kind of financing or strictly kind of financing private sector activities in the way that the IRA is.
I wanted to move on now to the actual operations of these different projects, right? You've spoken a lot to the different factors that go into site selection and all of the environmental compliance you need to do, all of the permits you need to collect, the whole complex process, right? Once you've actually chosen the site and you've gotten the permits and everything you need, how does Invenergy ensure that the renewable energy projects are actually operated in a way that minimizes negative impacts on the environment, human health, whether that's like noise pollution, air pollution, land degradation, whatever it might be?
Well, again, depending on the project and depending on the requirements of the local community, before you can get approval to build a project, we'll have to do things like glare studies for solar projects to make sure that it's not producing too much reflected sunlight in certain areas, sound studies for wind turbines. We'll have to think about and do planning and accounting for to minimize avian impact so that local birds are not impacted. In terms of the ground, again, we have like something we built out as like a vegetation management team. We think very, very carefully about how to protect the topsoil and how to encourage certain types of vegetation for the given project. We worked very, very closely, as I said, to make sure that we don't impact or minimize the impact for any local critical habitat. We have to be very, very mindful, and we will have to plan around any protected species that are in the area. We will, in certain cases, not source certain types of, in New York, for example, you can't build a solar project if it contains any sort of heavy metals. And there are certain domestic manufacturers that actually, the way that they build their photovoltaic panels, there is actually some heavy metals that are encased in this glass. And like you can't actually use the PV panels in the state of New York because of this requirement. So we'll have to source from an alternative supplier. And again, we'll work very, very closely with the local community as well to make sure that if there are very, very specific concerns to that community, that they're addressed. But there's a huge number of internal and external resources in terms of environmental testing and compliance and engineering that go into these projects to make sure that they are done, again, with environmental integrity and protection and human health as well. And then once the projects are fully operating, we'll have permanent staff on site, again, to perform maintenance to make sure that these projects are operating as they should. Again, these are like massive projects with lots of components that can fail, and wires get degraded or sometimes not properly installed in the first place. So it is an ongoing effort to make sure that these projects continue to produce energy as they should. And again, these are multi-$100-million projects. So it is in our interest, or any company that works in the space, to make sure that they are operating at maximal efficiency.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for that. And your point about approaching communities was great, because it was a perfect segue to my next question, which was, how do you actually approach communities that you want to work with? And like, how do you approach fostering partnerships with those communities, investors, the public sector, to actually execute these renewable energy projects, as you said, as most efficiently as you can?
This is something we talk a lot about and think a lot about, because there are no projects that do not get built on land. Actually, we are building out our offshore wind, this sort of a new-ish type initiative that's becoming an increasing focus of the company. But by and large, these projects are on land, and we have to go and secure land, again, through various types of contracts in order to have the footprint to host these sites. And considering the nature of these projects, that they're typically built in rural communities across the United States. And this is becoming a tougher part of the business, because more people know about renewable energy now than 10 or 20 years ago. There is a lot of misinformation out in the world. There are a lot of countervailing forces, a lot of astroturf groups that are being funded by oil and gas interests. And then there's sort of a cultural, I guess, association of renewable energy as well. So we think a lot about this, and it requires a lot of engagement with whichever local community that we're in, on the ground, meeting landowners, a lot of education, a lot of just getting to know people personally, working with public sector stakeholders, educating them on what really is a renewable energy project, what is a solar project, what is a wind project. No, like wind turbines are not going to give you cancer, that kind of stuff. And this process of getting to know and build these relationships with the local community and the public sector as well, it takes years for a given project. It can be a very arduous process, and a lot of, again, depending on the regulatory requirements, there can be numerous kind of public hearings where people will get to chime in on what they view about the project. So what we typically like to kind of emphasize is it's an interesting issue. It's a property rights issue, where if a particular, typically farmer or landowner, wants to sign with us, that is their right to do that. And often you'll get a lot of people will not be supportive of their neighbors wanting to contract with us. And so that's sort of an interesting dynamic. And there is a big kind of debate in a lot of these communities and from the state and local kind of public sector level about the trade-off of productive farmland to host these sites. Like that is a real question. But at the end of the day, I think we believe that these projects are necessary if a large enough group of people want to work with us and have either sell us their land or sign a lease with us to host the site. Like, we believe that that's their right to do that. And a lot of these communities, again, I said, are rural. They're very in need of investment, and there are not many industries that are pouring the enormous amount of resources that we are in terms of construction and ongoing employment that the renewable energy industry is. And for the landowners themselves, again, depending on whether or not they sell the property to us or they lease it for 25, 50 years, it can be far more lucrative for them to contract with a renewable energy developer than to farm the land themselves. And so there's a lot of members of the rural farming community who are doing quite well for themselves because they've decided to partner with the renewable energy industry. And it's been, I think, from an economic perspective, again, these are massive construction projects and investments into these local communities. And I think that there is both an economic and strategic benefit for domestically produced zero carbon energy, which is why there's all this federal funding for it.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that not only is developing these relationships the right thing to do, but it also makes things easier for everyone involved.
Yes, the projects wouldn't happen if we didn't build these relationships, if we didn't get buy-in from the respective landowners in the local community. We can't just go and say, hey, we're going to take over 2,500 acres and build this utility scale solar project. We don't have the legal right to do that. There is sort of an interesting debate, particularly something I haven't mentioned is that Invenergy is also building a couple of transmission line projects. These are our largest projects crossing, in some cases, several states, multi-billion-dollar projects. And this kind of gets into a whole discussion about, aside from the project, the biggest issue is the quality of the grid, of the transmission lines. And why is it that private companies are having to build these new transmission lines? Because the grid itself is not equipped to handle 21st century power needs and distribution. It's a 100-year-old system. But there's an ongoing debate about, for transmission line purposes, about the question of eminent domain. So for natural gas pipelines under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, they can go use eminent domain and just like take the land that they need to build those natural gas pipelines. And I think the renewable energy industry believes that there should be similar authority, at least for transmission lines, because of their critical nature to the fundamental power infrastructure of the United States, that there should be similar authority. And I'm speaking very generally, maybe my own opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the company. I should caveat that very clearly. But something interesting that I learned, I think it was Sheldon Whitehouse, the senator from Rhode Island, has proposed some legislation that would provide FERC with the same eminent domain power for transmission lines as it has for natural gas pipelines. And I think just this week, the Biden administration has outlined some of their own priorities for permitting reform. This is a big topic of discussion in Congress right now, although I actually haven't had a chance to look at the proposal yet. So outside of the government kind of empowering the acquisition of land for kind of critical national security purposes, we have to go and do the work. And that means talking with every landowner, every mayor, every county commissioner, planning board thing, and go through that process, because we're going to be long-term partners with this community. And we need their buy-in and their participation to build the project.
So as you're talking about building these relationships, you've mentioned that when you sort of first approach communities, there can be a little bit of reluctance or friction, maybe because of misinformation, maybe because of perceptions. I've worked in communications for a couple of years and have done some work around community outreach. So this is something that is very close to my heart. It also leads me to try to envision how specifically you're doing this. Is it a town hall? Is it a big meeting? Are you knocking on doors? And then when you do that, are there messages that you found to be particularly effective that you sort of lean on right away before you get to know people and sort of figure out what their concerns are and begin to speak more and more in their language?
Well, there's no copy paste approach. Every community is very different. Every state is very different. But it usually starts kind of at the landowner level, like that's, you don't start talking to the mayor or the county commissioner, or if you don't have a project to talk about. So that really is kind of introducing both the individual, the developer, introducing the company, explaining to them what we do, kind of what our intention is and learning about them. These are often generation landowners who've been often farming or utilizing the land for a very long time, learning about their family history, learning about their business, learning about what is going on in their lives. And then said, well, look, would you be open to the idea of us purchasing or leasing our land? This is a really wonderful financial opportunity for you and your family. Perhaps you could go find some additional land to farm, or you could still farm a portion of your land. And then we just go kind of door by door. Would your neighbors be interested? Let's learn about the local community and the dynamics that are going on there. And it is a very deliberate, slow process in most cases. And then once you have sort of enough land under control, at that point, you start a process of really going through getting permitting approvals and doing a lot of the other due diligence in terms of environmental compliance and engineering work, start laying the groundwork for a project. You're looking again for what we call offtake, trying to find that end user to sell the power to, which would then again provide the financing for the project. So it's a education process both ways. And we're mindful of like being a very well-capitalized company that's based in Chicago and of the renewable energy industry. Again, there's a lot of perceptions there, but it's just like putting kind of a face in front of a name and trying to explain what we're looking to accomplish. And then it's really a question of aligning economic incentives. And then there's often the case that there's a lot of peculiarities or particularities that folks are looking for to be addressed in terms of any bilateral agreement between the landowner and the company. And then once you get sort of to the community level, it depends. Sometimes you have as of what we call by right for solar or wind, meaning that as long as you're in compliance with the regulations, you can go build the project without any sort of kind of public outreach or vote. But in most cases, there will be typically one or more public meetings, town halls, where anyone and everyone can come and say their piece about the project. I heard a story yesterday from a more senior developer who was talking about a wind project that he was involved in, and he was at a town hall meeting. And I guess there was some guy there who had like a boombox or a loudspeaker and was just playing a continuous recording of the sound of a windmill turning over and over again throughout the meeting just to be disruptive. And it is often folks on the development team that will be in those meetings and kind of be responsible for answering the questions, but also taking a lot of the fire from people who are antagonistic to the project.
Okay. So going back to what you mentioned about using heavy metals in solar panels and how in some states that might not be legal or it's against the laws or the regulations of those respective states. How might a firm address the challenges and possibly leverage the opportunities of sourcing these materials sustainably and responsibly?
So Invenergy has a whole procurement arm, and procurement's a big deal these days. Supply chain issues through COVID, it was obviously very disruptive to our industry and many others. There's been this issue of solar tariffs that were implemented under the Trump administration and have been under suspension through the Biden administration. That's basically importing solar panels from China because certain domestic interests thought that China was undercutting the domestic U.S. market by highly subsidizing these panels. So that's not really answering your question, but I believe that there's a general industry effort downstream to make sure that components are built and sourced in an economic or an environmentally friendly way. I think that there's a much, much larger debate even beyond the renewable energy industry about rare earth minerals and sourcing things like silicone and nickel and cobalt that are required for electric vehicles and things like that, and how how you think about what is essentially drilling and mining and sort of these hard, heavy industries that we don't think about as environmentally friendly because they're not, but will be necessary to produce the raw materials needed for all of these clean energy technologies. And I think that there's a debate within the industry, or there's discussion with the industry, and then kind of the larger kind of end users of these raw materials, how we do that in the most environmentally friendly way. And I think one way that I think at a high level that we're trying to think about how to sort of gear up the domestic kind of mining industry. A lot of these materials are sourced from Africa. I think China is one of the largest producers and exporters of rare earth minerals. So again, there's sort of a national security component to this as well. But again, so far downstream, it's a little bit outside my wheelhouse and area of focus. But I do know that our company and I think the industry broadly is trying to source our materials in the most environmentally friendly way that is available.
So throughout this episode, we've been discussing how Invenergy develops its projects. Could you expand on what are the new and emerging trends in renewable and sustainable energy?
Sure. So I think I mentioned briefly offshore wind is becoming an emerging kind of component of the industry. And that's really, I think, being propelled by the administration in terms of regulatory back-end work, and then awarding leases and rights of huge sections of kind of shore, kind of the near shore ocean that can appropriately host large ocean-based wind turbines on both coasts. So that again is, I wouldn't quite call that a public-private partnership, but maybe that's getting a little bit closer. But there is certainly a policy, administrative, and regulatory framework that is allowing offshore wind, kind of setting that up in a way that it's poised for a huge expansion and a larger part of kind of the power mix moving forward over the next few decades. And internally, the company been building out teams and resources kind of on the development and engineering side to focus on offshore wind. Another area that is kind of emerging, and I think this is also being driven through, in large part through financial incentives, is green hydrogen, using kind of renewable energy to produce hydrogen that can then be in turn used to power various machines, which I think itself is somewhat of an inefficient process, but a lot of like heavy industry processes are currently powered through oil and gas or different types of fossil-based liquid fuels, and thinking how we're going to displace the use of those fossil-based liquids. I think green hydrogen is probably the pathway there, and that's been a mix of a kind of emerging technology, these converters, these catalytic converters, and using renewable energy to power the production of that green energy. And I'd read a really interesting article kind of about this, and I think there's sort of a debate in the sustainability community that green hydrogen is, like, again, from an energy perspective, I think it's very inefficient, but that it would be both from a cost perspective and a timing perspective when thinking about climate change, that going and putting large lithium ion batteries to every heavy industrial facility in the United States is not feasible from, again, a cost or timing perspective, and that things that are hot and spin will need some liquid-based fuels, and that green hydrogen is the most feasible way to, again, power those heavy industrial users and their processes without going through the LED battery scenario. And so under the IRA, there's a production tax credit, I think, for hydrogen. There's a lot of movement within the industry from different players to build up the kind of ecosystem in terms of the science, in terms of the infrastructure for green hydrogen, thinking about how you develop that market, how you sell green hydrogen, how you price it, I think is definitely something that you will see emerging within the renewable space over the next decade.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. We always like to wrap up with takeaways. You are a Harris alum yourself. You went to the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, where the co-hosts of this podcast are all currently students. Our question for you is, what from your Harris experience has been really valuable to you? And do you have any words of wisdom for how to make the most out of our time here in grad school?
It's a good question. Well, Harris is a great institution, and actually just this past weekend was celebrating our 10-year reunion, me and my classmates. And the school has really come quite a ways since I graduated. It was funny enough, I think when I started school, I had an interest, or I thought I would focus on energy and the environment, and took some classes towards that end, but ended up coming out with more of an economic development and housing focus. But certainly while you're at Harris, avail yourself to as many classes of interest as possible, and that includes auditing some courses to kind of manage that workload. Something that I did that I would really recommend is I took courses at the business school. I remember I took like a clean tech lab course, finance courses. I took courses at the law school. I took an undergraduate course on energy and the environment. And so I know that there's a lot of great classes at Harris that one should take as many of those as they can manage, but also take advantage of being at the university and the other professional schools and even the undergraduate courses there. I think if there are internship opportunities that you can take while you're in school, not just the summer, in an industry of interest, like I would recommend doing that. Harris, I think, was sort of an interesting fit for me. I am not a quantitative person by any sense. When I started digging into math and statistics problems, it's funny enough, it's sometimes kind of like a colorblind person trying to appreciate a painting, I guess is how I would describe it for me sometimes. So it was a struggle for me, particularly the core, and those stats classes in particular almost broke my spirit. But I think that it did push me, the education, kind of beyond my comfort zone. It did refine my ability to understand policy, to be able to read academic papers, to be able to look at statistical and economic research and understand it better, and be more thoughtful in terms of the interaction of public policy and legislation and regulatory frameworks and how that impacts what goes on in the private sector. And so I think outside of the first couple of years after Harris, I have worked exclusively in the private sector. And I think my Harris education has given me a different vantage point and a set of skills and knowledge that some of the MBA folks and law school students don't have. And I think it is underappreciated to the extent that whether you're talking about state and local issues or federal issues, the extent to which policy and legislation and politics does redound to private business, private capital markets. And so I think that having a policy education, certainly from the Harris School, can be a really great advantage for individuals. And I think, too, a lot of the places that I've been, even on the private sector side, have required direct interface and interaction with public sector officials. And I worked in the public sector, certainly earlier in my career. And so I like to say that I speak public sector. The folks who work in government, either for a time or for their career, they have different ways of thinking about things, different ways of speaking, different considerations. And I've been in many, many meetings where you had very, very successful private sector executives trying to get what they needed from the public sector folks wearing very expensive suits. And they end up conducting themselves in kind of suboptimal ways. And where I've found that my Harris education has really been very helpful is kind of allowing me to sit at that intersection between the public and private sectors, understanding the mindset and incentives and objectives of people on both sides of the table, and being sort of a translator and finding a pathway of kind of mutual benefits as well as mutual respect that will allow the partnership or the initiative to get what it needs from both sides to move forward.
That is such a hopeful, hope-inspiring answer. Being in the middle of school, it is really valuable to hear how you think about it as someone who has had a little bit of time and space from the education. So thank you.
I think for me, my biggest takeaway is that There's lots of overlap between renewable development and development within other industries in this phase-based approach, and the considerations that we take when we talk about social license to operate, feasibility reports, financing, and all those things. It's many industries, they do operate in a similar manner with regard to development.
Logan, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I honestly really thought the point about community engagement, that these renewable development projects cannot happen without developing relations with the community, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it makes everyone's lives easier here. I think that's just such an insightful point, right? Is that we're able to develop these projects, we're able to create a booming green industry while also taking into consideration the needs and wants of the communities that are being impacted. That's just great to me.
My takeaway is about some of the brass tacks mechanics of how these green energy projects get started. Just the image of like walking through a community and knocking on doors in rural areas. I'm from a rural area. 1 house per mile is sort of like a not uncommon density. So just imagining those door knocks, those conversations, and then the way that gets sort of snowballs into a full wind farm or a full solar farm, and engagement with local officials, and then ultimately something that contributes to a local grid or is capable of operating particularly energy intensive digital infrastructure. That's a wild image to imagine. I think my takeaway is just that image, that's where it starts. And if you do that enough times, then we are able to make these really significant green contributions to the grid. My takeaway is just the image of that first moment, and then an appreciation for the way that scales up into this huge, tremendous thing. All right. Nick Epstein, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me and wanting to talk to me. I had fun.
Thank you for joining us on From the Ground Up. If you have thoughts or questions, or if you would like to talk to us on air, drop us a line at uc3pfromthegroundup@gmail.com.